Have you ever tried to copy a drawing just by looking at it? You don't get to trace it. Just eyeball the artwork and try to draw it freehand. Your copy might look similar, but it probably won't be perfect, even if you're a skilled artist. The year is 1989.
I want to hear Yoko Ono, right? Because I have her live. And he goes, looks at like and go, it's just 20 minutes of oh!
Sega's technological warlock, Yu Suzuki, maintained his goal to create unique, immersive experiences, instead of refining ideas and concepts that already exist. It's what got him into making Taikon games, or body sensation games. A perfect example is Hang On. Instead of pressing buttons to make a picture of a motorcycle drive through a track, the arcade machine has you physically mounting a motorcycle replica, leaning with it to steer, all while scaling sprites give you the perspective of careening down a road. He wants to bring the player closer to feeling like they're really there, as if they're physically in the experience. These sprite-based Taikon games are now scattered throughout the 80s. Suzuki wanted to take this to the next step. Polygonal games aren't new either, but he knew it could be better. His team, Sega R&D 8, became Sega AM2, tasked with beating the System 21 board from chief competitor Namco. So they got to work on the CG board, later called Model 1. Whether he knew it or not, this became a major step into cementing Yu Suzuki as a pioneer. Suzuki told Edge magazine it took them 3 years to make this board, at a time when new graphics hardware typically took 1 year. During this long development phase, they got the okay to work on a racing game alongside creating the new hardware. By March of 1992, they began showing the public this project. Here in the Takanawa Prince Hotel, a full-size Formula 1 replica car is parked by one of the first 16:9 widescreen monitors ever produced. You can see the full polygonal race experience glowing on screen. This playable build of BV came to the Kokusai Sports Fair by May, and later that summer, the prototype VR, blazoned with a coat of red, came to Shibuya Gold. Suzuki said, "Cars have always been a big hobby of mine, and I've just been lucky that racing games are always in vogue." He told Sega magazine the handling is supposed to be that of a Bugatti, but inside the model of an F1 car. He doesn't want this to be a 100% accurate racing simulation, he just wants it to be fun. Later that year, in 1992, arcade goers finally got behind the wheel. It was an overwhelming success. Virtua Racing was the highest earning deluxe cabinet in North America for almost a year, according to Replay, leaving these weaker imitations behind in VR's thick exhaust fumes. Both the hardware and game are revolutionary. Becoming one of the first fully polygonal racers, arguably the turning point that would define this type of game. Yu Suzuki's mission to immerse people into an experience beyond the typical mold of video games just finished an Olympic-worthy pole vault.
Select course by wheel and step on gas pedal.
It only has 3 tracks, ranging in difficulty. All are masterfully designed, rewarding players who invest time and practice into learning the course. Landmarks are purposely placed throughout the environment to help the player remember when a specific turn is about to squeal the tires. It's also celebrated for the extraordinarily tight and fluid controls that Suzuki cared so much about. This lightning-fast arcade game performs like no other 3D racer of the time, streaming at a flawless 30 frames per second. Even those blocky mannequin-looking dudes were among the first polygon humans to ever appear in video games. You may think these flat, shiny polygons are primitive now, but in the early 90s, this was magic. Throughout 1994, Virtua Formula, a hulking 8-player adaptation, would go into amusement parks and entertainment centers across the world. Computer and Video Games magazine said one 4-player cabinet cost £250,000. That's about $500,000 after inflation. A fat wad of dosh. They even found a way to port it to the 16-bit Genesis to process all those polys. It needs some extra oomph. So they crammed the Sega Virtua processor right inside the cartridge, making it a hefty fella compared to other games. Its price tag is also more hefty. Side note, the SVP appears to be better than the Super FX chip. The 32X got its own port later in '94 called Virtua Racing Deluxe, featuring 2 exclusive tracks and 2 new cars. In the background of 1994, Sega's also racing to get its 5th-gen home console into stores. Given the insane success of Virtua Racing, it makes sense to firmly plomp this instant coin-op classic onto a Saturn disc. By this time, Sega's Model 2 board is already surpassing Virtua Racing, with arcade games like Daytona USA flexing those textured graphics. But Suzuki's F1 masterpiece is still riding on tidal waves of goodwill. Yet Sega's just too busy to make the Saturn port themselves. Historically, they prefer to manage their own IPs in-house, especially Virtua Racing, but this time, they're letting American developers take the property for a spin. And despite having the most content of any port to this day, Saturn easily has the most controversial Virtua Racing game. Get a load of this blast processing. Virtua Racing on the Genesis. No add-on, just the console and a modified cartridge. Yeah, it might be a 15 frame per second pixelated downgrade, but it plays surprisingly well, and even supports split screen. Virtua Racing Deluxe on 32X is a noticeable step up, maintaining those familiar, slick controls. Most fans will agree these are both viable ports. Many hail the 32X port as their all-time favorite. Both accurately handle like the original coin-op cars. Saturn's Virtua Racing is where hardcore fans are a little more divided. It does have 4 extra cars, 7 new tracks, and a Grand Prix mode, still standing today as the port with the most content. But its handling does not match the arcade. This feels different. Some players don't mind and still like it, maybe calling it their favorite port. But when a racing game is so loved for its remarkably tight controls, many will get frustrated inside Saturn's F1 cockpit. There's a decent amount of people who just plain hate this port. If you spend hours playing any of these 3 Virtua Racers, you will very likely notice discrepancies when playing it on Saturn. Even some visual things like the car models are not a match. So what happened? Why are the controls and performance so different?
I had been, doing the usual stuff last year at school, applying to places.
In school, did you focus on sort of like game design or like design for
Nope. Not a bit of it, not at all.
Oh wow.
So in high school, actually really starting in junior high, my circle, myself and my buddies, kind of all got into computers, and that was when home computers started to become a thing. And so like my first computer was a Timex Sinclair 1000, was shipped to me from England.
Chuck Tolman graduated from UC Santa Barbara in 1993. He told me and my Shiro podcast cohort, Patrick Trainer, he was really not looking for jobs in video games. Then Mike Alexander, a high school buddy of his, recommended Tolman work with him at Atari Tengen. This is not the same Atari responsible for the Jaguar. Tengen is a division of Atari Games, mainly tasked with porting arcade games to home consoles.
And I hadn't even, up to that point, I hadn't even considered it. I got a CS degree, and I was just applying to places like Microsoft and sort of your typical software engineering stuff.
He scored the gig later that year, helping develop Dick Vitale's Awesome Baby College Hoops for Genesis,
Awesome, baby!
and RBI Baseball 95 on 32X, programming right alongside his friend Mike. At around this time, Tengen became Time Warner Interactive. Under both names, the company is primarily known for bringing its own arcade games to home consoles, having a long-standing relationship with Sega. But in 1994, the company began porting someone else's game.
It was not normal for us to do that kind of thing because the general business model there was we took our coin-op games and we ported them to consoles. So this was some kind of arrangement that came into being. I don't even know exactly how that came about, where Tengen agreed to do this Saturn port of Virtua Racing.
This is an exciting undertaking for them, since Virtua Racing is such a major franchise. But it does come with an unusual obstacle.
Interestingly, it wasn't a port at all. Actually, what we did was we looked at Virtua Racing, the original game, and we just mimicked it. We just eyeballed it. So basically, we play that game, and we would record everything, and then we would build our own version based off of just all the information we had tabulated about the original.
Remember what I said about copying a drawing freehand? This is what porting a video game without the source code is like. The source provides all the original assets, data, and code, making it easier to trace the game onto another machine. Sega did not give Time Warner the source code for Virtua Racing, but they at least gave him one of these big boys.
Virtua Racing arcade machine in your office, and you guys just filmed it or something?
Yeah, basically. And
That's awesome.
Was that like
cool.
yeah. Did you direct capture it, or was this film it with a video recorder?
as I recall, I think it was just recording it with like a camcorder or something.
That's crazy.
Yeah, we just basically, and whenever you weren't sure if you got the feel right on something, you'd go back and you'd play the original again, and you'd base it off of kind of eyeballing it.
Jeez, you guys Donkey Kong that thing.
Yeah.
They were given some model data from the original 3 tracks, but everything else is built from scratch. Tolman and his team had to reverse engineer Virtua Racing. Did you guys want the source code, or did you guys at any point ask for it and were denied, or was it just...
You know what? I don't actually know. I don't know whether there was any sort of discussion. That I only know that when we were put onto it, it was like, okay, this is what you're doing.
It's already strange they were given little more than a spare arcade machine. What might be even stranger is the dev kit situation. Tolman recalls game development starting around the late summer of 1994. They didn't get a Saturn dev kit until much later that year. Earlier in this series, we discovered SimCity's devs didn't get their kit until December. This means for the first few months of creating a Virtua Racing port, Time Warner had no source code and no Saturn hardware to work with.
At the beginning, we didn't have anything, and Mike went over to Sega of America. But he had to go to Sega of America, and he had to... Oh, right! He had to work overnight. He had to do the swing shift. So basically, they would work on their stuff during the day, and when they were done, he'd come in and he would do what he needed to do at night. That's how it was, because they didn't have any kits they could give out. So because they didn't have any more kits, that's the only way that they could let us work on the kits, was to let us borrow time from them.
Oh, that kind of sucks.
At Sega of America. It was insane.
They eventually got their Sophia unit, and Mike was able to come back to his own office building. They're used to working with Genesis dev kits, a similar size to the consumer console. Sophia was a thicker lady.
I remember being kind of blown away at how big and heavy it was. Kind of primitive looking. I mean, it was big and bulky and heavy, and it had this CD drive bolted under the top.
One of Tolman's main jobs was debugging. In his experience, the debugger is usually inside the dev kit or attached to the box somehow. He tells us Sophia doesn't have a debugger. Instead, he had to use a separate Hitachi E7000 PC integrated circuit emulator That was also pretty big. You couldn't just plug this thing into a port in the back of Sophia. Plugging in the Hitachi was a little more involved.
You'd open it up, you'd have to very carefully extract the CPU. And you would plug in, you would take this thing that was on these big thick cables, on the end of these big thick cables coming out of the hardware ICE unit. And you would have to very carefully slot it into where the CPU would normally go. And it would emulate the CPU.
If you've ever built a gaming PC, chances are you had to carefully put the CPU into the motherboard socket, crossing your metaphorical fingers that you don't bend any of those precious pins. So what Time Warner had to do, they had to take apart the Sophia, take out its CPU, and carefully slot the big plug from the Hitachi into Sophia's CPU socket every time they wanted to debug. And that's a little more than once or twice.
It was nuts. Like, I'd never seen a debugger like it. It was crazy.
I assume that the CPU was socketed instead of like soldered onto the machine.
Oh yeah, it was socketed, but it was like a million pins. And I remember one of our ICEs we had to send back because trying to get it into that CPU socket was pretty difficult. And we ended up bending the pins on one of them.
Ooh.
And
dang.
this is like a $15,000 piece of hardware. When we bent the pins on that, we were just face palming so hard.
The Saturn console is known for having 2 processors. Cooking with both fires could provide more power for the games, if the developers figure out how. Several Japanese teams and the more experienced Saturn developers were able to use both processors, but many of the early games only used one. Tolman only mentioned one debugger plug.
A lot of the developers we talked to basically told us they basically just used the one CPU. I'm thinking that maybe because they couldn't debug the second one, it was a little harder, that maybe because they had that debug information on the first one.
Maybe that's why. Yeah, that might be why. Maybe that was it. The first one you could get debug off of, and the second one you couldn't, so they replaced the second one with this hardware emulator.
This archaic debugging routine would explain why early Saturn games don't use that second processor.
It was really interesting. I've never seen anything else like it ever, before or after.
Like many other Saturn dev teams, they too had a difficult time burning disks for tests. This slowed early development, but they eventually figured out an efficient routine for burning those beta builds. He says they spent roughly a year just porting the base arcade game. That's a year spent on eyeballing the driving physics, car models, and gameplay, and getting it all to gel with the original 3 track models. It almost seems like Sega would have had an easier time porting it themselves, instead of getting outsiders to replicate it using sheer observation. Tolman says Sega outsourced this port because they were just too busy. Makes sense. They had a lot of stuff going on.
As far as I know, it's because they didn't have the internal bandwidth since they were doing other things, and they really wanted more software for the launch. Although, ironically, we couldn't make their launch.
We started our rollout of Sega Saturn yesterday.
I don't need to talk about the American Saturn launch again. You've all heard the story by now. Planned for Saturn Day, September 2nd, 1995. Surprise launch earlier that year at E3 on May 11th.
It's out there.
Sega originally tasked Time Warner with a September 2nd deadline. Like the other American developers we've spoken with, Tolman was not given much warning about the surprise launch.
It cracks me up though, like thinking that they could get a launch title out of this when they weren't sending us any source code or assets. I don't know how that came about. Even September was a bit tight, but that's what we were always working towards. So when they told us that they were going to accelerate their time frame, we were like, okay, sure, go ahead, but you're not going to have us on there.
You guys are like, yeah, not going to make it. That's way too soon.
No, there was no chance.
Tolman toiled away at debugging and on polishing the game engine, while the rest of the team handled things like graphics, sound, and the in-house rescore of Virtua Racing's music. Even though they had track model data from Sega, they still need to make sure their car physics drive them just like the original.
Spent a fair amount of time early on just trying to get the original tracks to seem correct, right? Because they had to match. And the cars had to match the feel.
So, how well did they do? When comparing ports of Virtua Racing, results can vary based on things outside the core gameplay engine. I'm talking about things like how the D-pad handles what started as analog steering, frame rates, the real-time speed at which a game plays. I really can't do that many actual tests to prove differences in car performance, but I can show you this. Across all ports of the 90s, arcade mode on the Big Forest track has you starting in the pit stop. In all 4 games, I will do nothing but hold the gas button. No steering, no braking, no letting off the gas. It's just going to be me holding the gas pedal firmly against the floor until the race stops.
Okay, Flores!
Let's compare how long it takes to hit the first wall. You're looking at the arcade OG running in MAME, Genesis Unreal hardware, 32X emulated with Kega, and Time Warner's port on a real Saturn. Just for shits, let's throw in the Switch port, since it's using the original source code. I'm only playing NTSC releases. You'll notice right away, the kilometers per hour are all different. The difference in speed readings could be due to how the buttons register what's normally a pressure-sensitive gas pedal. But what really stands out is the lap timer. In the arcade, the car hits the wall at precisely 6 seconds 03 milliseconds. The first frame bouncing away from the wall is at 06 milliseconds. The Genesis port, running at half the frame rate, hits at exactly 6 seconds, bouncing away at 6 seconds 06 milliseconds, just like the arcade. 32X's VR Deluxe has triple-digit milliseconds on its lap timer and runs at 20 frames per second. It hits the wall at precisely 6 seconds, bouncing at 041 milliseconds. This timer cannot display 6 seconds 06 milliseconds, likely due to the frame rate. Saturn's car hits the wall at 7 seconds 38 milliseconds, a vast difference from Sega's games. The Switch's lap timer behaves identically to arcades. I noticed on Saturn there's a quick animation of the car coming down from a lift, not letting you accelerate until 69 milliseconds after the timer starts. Subtracting that 69 still doesn't get the Saturn's lap timer close to the others. Looking at the rest of this comparison, the countdown timer in the top center only lines up between Genesis and 32X ports. You will notice there's some degree of auto-steering programmed into these games. That's getting the car back on track after it crashes. That's not me steering. Sega Jesus is taking the wheel here. What the car does throughout the entire race doesn't really line up in any port. Between Switch and arcade, a lot of the crash behavior is the same, but it's still not a one-for-one match. Now, if you're not familiar with this game, the arcade mode has a timer that counts down, and you get a time bonus every time you pass a checkpoint. You have to drive fast enough to keep the timer from reaching 0 before finishing the race, just like any other arcade racer. Saturn's Virtua Racing is the only one that can't complete a lap without touching steering. Genesis lasts the longest, beating the 32X port by a hair. Genesis Virtua Racing appears to be built from at least some of the arcade game's code. Deluxe seems to be built from Genesis, making the arcade cabinet its grandfather. Time Warner's Virtua Racing is a very distant cousin. And the Switch port is some genetically modified clone grown in an underground lab. Not to be confused with World Series Baseball. I can't really do these tests with steering since there's just too much variance, but I can speak about how it feels. I personally don't mind the Saturn's D-pad steering, provided I'm not constantly thinking about original Virtua Racing. They tried making the amount of steering gradually increase the more you press the D-pad. This avoids that all-or-nothing touchiness. It just makes quick steering a bit of a pain. If you can't stomach it and need analog steering, this is compatible with the racing wheel. Many racing wheel games like Daytona have support for the 3D control pad. Didn't come out till the year after. Daytona just sort of treats the 3D pad like it's a racing wheel. Virtua Racing sadly does not do this. The 3D pad doesn't work here. But I was able to map the racing wheel to an analog controller in an emulator, just to see what it's like. And it works pretty well. I'd almost say this is my preferred way to play Saturn's Virtua Racing. Analog steering won't make it more true to the original, but it is way more responsive. If you have an actual Saturn racing wheel and want to use it on the game, your results might vary. Some people say it works well, others, like my friend Saturn Dave, say it doesn't really help much. This could also depend on what condition your racing wheel is in. In the original game, it feels like you need to catch the curves under the grip of your tires, hitting the brakes at just the right moments, then apply the right amount of steering and gas to latch on and cruise across like a well-oiled zipline. On the Saturn, even while using analog steering, you barely have to brake at all on most tracks. You can let off the gas for a split second, then drift through and slide across the curve, pushing through with gas at the end. You do need to use the brakes occasionally, but not nearly as often in the arcade game. These are not bad controls by themselves. This handling is actually quite nice, but when compared to the original, it's not the same. Visually, the F1 cars have slightly different looking models, especially noticed with the spoiler shapes, top, and lack of exhaust pipes. As far as I can tell, there's no crash damage on Saturn. Graphics on the track almost match. Almost. They use fewer polygons on the Saturn, so many of the environmental objects aren't as detailed, and road edges look flatter. Some of the colors are also off. For example, this patch of green is a dirt brown on Saturn. On the arcade, the tunnel in Bay Bridge makes your car sound more bold and echoey. On Saturn, the tunnels don't change any sound. Despite these differences, the layout of the roads are all pretty much the same. There is one issue with hills. If you're going up a hill and there's opponents on the other side, you might see their car models through the track in some sort of layering issue. This doesn't happen often. The other visual kerfuffle is frame rate. Saturn's Virtua Racing appears to run at an erratic 25 frames per second. You'll see it change often throughout races. It's not consistent, usually hanging out in the fewer than 25 territory.
Time bonus!
Once they programmed the arcade tracks and car to an acceptable state, Tolman and much of his team decided to add their own content. Much of mid-1995 was spent creating those new tracks and cars. Since this is a home console game, they felt it needed more than just one vehicle and 3 circuits. They're breaking the standard set by Sega, whose own Saturn port of Daytona USA does not add content. Console consumers have different expectations than quarter-wielding arcade goers.
They pay up front a much higher amount of money, and then they expect to be able to play and play and play and play. So for that model, three tracks isn't really enough, at least in our opinion. So we had a lot of experience putting games on consumer, porting coin-op games to consumers. So I think we just had a sort of a sense, a gut instinct that we needed a lot more tracks and vehicles. We needed to be able to give you more to do so that you would feel like it was worth your money.
And more tracks they gave. In total, the game shipped with 10 tracks, more than triple the arcade's amount, and double what the 32X port has. Even the PS2 port years later had just 6 tracks. 10? That's a real deal console racing game. Like the cabinet, all 10 range in difficulty, starting with the easiest course, Amazon Falls. This beginning track is nothing more than a standard circle, a cozy NASCAR track in the jungle to get you started. Right away, you can hear the all-new music introducing the race, fitting that jungle theme. They scored the soundtrack in the same style as the original, a longer song at the beginning of the race, followed by a short burst of music at each checkpoint. Their game has a mixture of the original arcade melodies and some new songs. They're mostly good, I kinda like them, but one of Time Warner's songs does sound like a Roseanne transition. I will criticize some of the sound effects. The engine sound is weak compared to the other games. When selecting a track, you can see the menu gives you a nice 3D model of the course, a clear idea of what you're about to drive on. Or you could watch these FMV cutscenes.
My heart is pounding like a ceremonial drum just thinking about a race within the primitive jungles of the very...
Tolman tells me he doesn't remember the story behind these videos, but he does remember laughing at them.
You think you've sweat before? Think again.
The second course is Surfers Speedway Oval in Australia. Despite this, it starts right side up, sending you down 3 straightaways divided by 3 large turns. In the second straight strip, there's a very small snake turn with an elevation change. Now if you drive straight through it at high speeds, you go airborne. Be careful here, it's real easy to mess up this jump.
The last time I raced at Surfer Speedway, I set a world record.
Next is Big Forest, the first track in the arcade classic. This professional circuit sends you right past the pit stop and straight for the triangular pine trees. The manageable variety of soft and hard turns normally require you to use the brakes. With Time Warner's physics, you can tear through Big Forest without any brakes at all, just maybe occasionally letting off the gas before turns.
Don't get sleepy though, because if you miss the next hairpin at the amusement park, you'll be having ale and bratwurst with the pit crew.
Alpine is another track from Time Warner, piercing the snowy mountains of Europe. A personal favorite. I don't believe the track is icy though. In fact, I didn't notice any weather condition effects throughout the entire game. Alpine comes out strong with a 180 turn after the starting line, right before winding tunnels. It's mostly twisty downhill roads with a few right angle curves. Don't drive into this tunnel, Wiley. It's a trap.
Buckle up, babies, and get ready to freeze.
You're then taken to the classic Bay Bridge, the second of 3 arcade tracks. It begins with the titular Bay Bridge, quickly curving your path into a series of narrow twists, truly testing your precision like none of the aforementioned courses. This is where you have to make tough decisions on when to pass your opponents without crashing into them from behind. You must invest time into Bay Bridge. And that's the case with all these tracks. It only gets more challenging from here.
Better let out the parachute for a crazy little maze of exits and off-ramps. And if you're lucky, you'll make it back to the bridge to do it all over again.
Track 6 takes you back to Surfer Speedway, except this time, instead of the third long curve, you must face 2 consecutive hairpins, diving deeper into the center of its environment. A nice variant of the course. If you play the first version of Surfer Speedway and drive up to where it branches out, you can see there's a barrier blocking the road.
Sure, it starts with the same wide turn. Sure, it goes into the same long straightaway. Then we gotcha with a quick right turn at the fork.
Up next is the Great Diablo Canyon of North America. Another one of Time Warner's creations. You start by plummeting into one large 180 with long lines of canyon bluff faces on either side. Then driving under the large rocks before a fun back and forth romp down a desert mountain. Another favorite course of mine.
Diablo means devil, and that's who must have designed this US track within this Grand Prix circuit.
The last of the 3 arcade originals is Acropolis in Greece. It starts with several small turns before sending you through this vicious, well-known loop. Like a true bobby pin, you must carefully move through the turn, back into the other side of the same stretch of road. Yeah, you gotta use the brakes here. You're then left with more rapid turns through a mountainside, demanding your uninterrupted concentration. I know it's the expert stage, but for some reason, I always find this easier than Bay Bridge. Maybe I just suck at Bay Bridge.
You'd better hope the gods are smiling when you hit those hairpins, or you'll be taking a bath in the Mediterranean.
Like a true city layout, Metropolis in Japan is filled with several extremely sharp turns. It ends with this fantastic tunnel on the outskirts of town.
And don't hit the sake till you're in the winner's circle.
Nice, a don't drink and drive message. It's not too challenging, but a mistake here will punish you. In these harder courses, the AI puts up a fight, with its top computer opponents barely making any mistakes. The metagame becomes passing as many opponents as you can in the first 2 laps without crashing. Once you get ahead early, you're safe. In these harder races, crashing early will almost ruin your chances at victory. When the pack is this tight, it's not uncommon to get crashed into from behind while recovering. Might as well reset if that happens. At long last, we end the 10-track list with Pacific Coast, a brutal course in North America. 2-lane roads with less than wide turns are considered a luxury here. Don't let this pleasing coastal environment fool you. This is a violent storm of those sharp, narrow turns. The final exam for whatever precise driving skills you manage to pick up. They put this at the end for a reason, but once you learn its curves, this becomes a delightful track. Another one of my favorites.
Don't give up now. You're in the countryside where you can make some time through some sweet curves.
Okay, back off, lady.
Sweet curves.
Fun fact! Sega AM2 originally planned 10 courses for the arcade game. They instead focused on making 3 good courses, partially due to time constraints. I think Time Warner absolutely nailed the look and aesthetic. These new courses look like they belong in Virtua Racing. Same blocky models, great use of bright colors, and they keep up with the happy atmosphere. Nice hot air balloon. Based on what Tolman tells us, it doesn't sound like they spent nearly as much time on their track design as they did porting the arcade tracks. I do think most of them play similarly to the predecessors. They have you navigate snaking turns that change in elevation, hairpins, tunnels, street roads, thread through tall rock faces and mountains. Most reward you for investing time into track memorization. Like the originals, new tracks put landmarks by certain curves to help your muscle memory. The only 2 odd tracks out are Amazon Falls and Surfer Speedway Oval, since they're just way too easy. No skill required. My primary criticism with this port is the shoddy collision detection. Sometimes going off-road at all will result in a full-stop crash. This could be anything from going into the grass or tapping a barrier the wrong way. There were other times where I drove off-road for a long time in the same spots and didn't bail. It's like you're rolling a dice with the game every time you leave pavement. This is a little more predictable when running into cars. Most of these crashes make sense, but you do get a dumb vehicle crash every once in a while. Tolman does not remember the specifics on why or where this happens, but he does remember they primarily focused on getting the actual track to play correctly. Somewhat understandable, since you're always faster when staying on the asphalt.
It's been too long since I was in there to be able to analyze what the fail point is on that. I think we focused so much, we focused a lot more, I think, on the roads, the proper track, than we did on the fringes. So
makes total sense, right?
it's not too surprising if there are bugs outside of the track.
Tolman says making sure this looks like Virtua Racing was important to them. You guys kept the original look of the game in terms of like those flat shaded no textures on the polygons for the cars or the tracks. How important was that to you guys to sort of maintain that original look?
Super important. We never felt I don't remember ever anybody suggesting on the team that we felt like we should change that. We wanted to match the look and feel of the original.
It's always nice when a choir lets you down easy. The new presentation, redone music, and treasure trove of extra content truly make this feel like Time Warner's Virtua Racing. The new vehicles are one of its strongest additions, starting you out with go-karts. Hell yeah. After making your Grand Prix profile and selecting one of several race teams, you begin a series of tournaments with a whopping 10 laps per race. Hope you're in the mood for a marathon. The teams do nothing more than change your color scheme. I, of course, went with Team Saturn to avert getting judo flipped by the chairman. At the end of each race, you earn points depending on how well you placed. The tournament resets when you graduate to the next vehicle. The amount of points needed to graduate increases with each car. You're given the freedom to select which of the 10 tracks you want to race on per tournament. The 3-speed go-karts are very slow, locking you into the double-digit miles per hour. Even though a go-kart race can easily take 10 minutes, I still had fun with these little poot-poots. They're actually a pretty good time. You only need 2 races here to graduate to the coupe. The coupe is difficult to control at first, but once you get used to how it slides, it becomes a glide. You barely have to use the brakes in these bad boys. I was quickly relieved by its speed, about twice as fast as the go-karts. These new vehicles have noticeably different handling from the classic F1 cars. It makes gliding around the classic arcade tracks extra fun. Familiar territory, but a new experience. The third car is this Pinewood Derby looking F-160. I think these are my favorite. It has the same top speed as the coupe, but a much higher horsepower. The speed and handling really favor the new circuits, and still gel with the 3 classics. I find myself coming back to the F-160s in arcade mode. They're especially fun on the challenging tracks, since the modest speed and fun handling make those sweet curves more manageable. Next is the GTP, probably my least favorite car. It feels like the handling doesn't keep up with its fast speeds. I couldn't stop crashing with this thing. Its steering doesn't seem to fit with how the tracks are designed. They barely match at all, almost like this car was made for a different game. I'd take a 20-minute go-kart race over this trash heap. The GTP appears to mimic the prototype car from 32X. But as far as Tolman knows, they did not visit Virtua Racing Deluxe while developing the Saturn edition.
To be honest, I don't recall us even looking at the 32X version.
This would also explain why the 32X's 2 extra tracks are not here. The 5th and final vehicle is that mock-up of good old Reliable, the F1 car. This is where Grand Prix gets serious, requiring you to throw down on all 10 tracks for one tournament. Even though they offer more depth, the way these game modes are set up is sort of problematic. Arcade has only 3 tracks, which makes sense, but in order to play a non-Grand Prix race on the new tracks, you have to select them in practice mode. Now, it is possible to play the new tracks in arcade mode if you enter a cheat code. Type in YXZ as your initials in a Grand Prix file, then the new tracks become playable in arcade mode. This also opens up CPU opponents in practice to a full race. Another weird thing. To do split screen 2-player, you have to go to the options menu and change it in settings. Why? Go! What's interesting is how much freedom Sega gave Time Warner. Sega of Japan, in this time period, is particularly infamous for being very controlling over its IP. For example, bug developer David Warhol told my Shiro podcast team their platformer was originally going to be a Sonic game, but SOJ gave them a firm hell no, so they made a bug instead. Sega of America could sometimes be like helicopter parents with quality assurance, especially for Robert Leyland and his team making Gen War. SOA constantly rejected their builds of Gen War for little issues. Sega was neither controlling nor helicopter parenty with Time Warner. They were pretty much allowed to do whatever the hell they wanted. Again, the company does have a long-standing relationship with Sega.
Anything extra we threw in was just stuff we came up with. Like, any new cars or new tracks, that was just stuff we invented. And they didn't pay super close attention to us. I'm talking about Sega. And so we would send them builds and they would be like, yeah, cool. They might tell us if they found problems, but it wasn't like, oh, this car, and we didn't run things through like a pre-approval process. We just said, hey, we want to add a car. And they're like, what's it like? And describe it, what we wanted to add. And they're like, cool, go ahead. Oh, we want to add a track, sure.
Depending on how well you do in Grand Prix, you get to watch the classic award ceremony video, throwing your hat in celebration. You see those jagged polygon babes? People used to really enjoy seeing those jagged polygon babes. Tolman says there's a super secret movie, only viewable using a never-before-published cheat code.
Do you guys know about the super secret bonus movie?
No, what is it?
All right, so I have something to share. So this is a cool secret that, as far as Mike knows, either of us know, has never been revealed to the public, which is that there's a secret movie that you can unlock if you're on the Time Warner Presents screen. And this might only, in fact, work on initial boot. You hit down, I think it's 50 times. We're not sure if we're remembering that correctly. It could be 49 or 51, but it's one of those three. You hit down 50 times. Then you hit down, left, right, up, right, left, right, left. That sequence should unlock the movie viewer. And the movie viewer includes a movie that has rarely been seen.
I spent a couple hours trying to punch it in, even trying a few different variations, but no dice. I'll leave this to the professional cheat code hunters. Good luck. I did, however, find the secret movie in the game's files, and Tolman confirmed this is the one. You can see it's the developers. They're racing on the sidewalk in a live-action, stop-motion cutscene, scooting their butts in the sidewalk with steering wheels in hand. Tolman also spoke of a supercar, the mysterious sixth vehicle. If you manage to succeed in typing the aforementioned cheat code, you can unlock the supercar from the menu.
So that's supposed to unlock the movie viewer, and then in the movie viewer, you hit C to play movie, you hit B to reset. I don't know what he means by reset, but you hit B to reset, and you can unlock the supercar.
The supercar.
So the supercar. So I believe to unlock the supercar from the movie viewer, I think it's a chord. I think you hit X, Y, and C together as a chord.
Even though I couldn't get the cheat code to work, I really wanted to see that supercar. According to Procrastination Land, you can unlock it the pure organic way by taking first place in all Grand Prix races. Then hover over the F-160 in practice mode, press Z, and it becomes the F-20 supercar. The website does not specify if you have to play a certain difficulty, or if you must play all 10 races with each vehicle. I couldn't find any action replay code to unlock supercar. Those later races in the F1 class are very difficult, so meeting this qualification would be challenging. I placed first in all 10 go-kart races, thinking maybe that would do the trick. It didn't. So I had to play through all of the Grand Prix again, graduating up every car and place first in each race. I did this with an emulator because I wanted analog steering. The gamepad I was using started drifting to the left midway through, so that kinda sucked. I eventually plugged in a different gamepad and grinded my way up, resetting the race if I crashed too much and couldn't win. Hundreds of laps later, I did it. I even got a hilarious new victory movie. Your man throws the hat so far it goes into space, flying past a Virtua astronaut before eclipsing the sun. Then I went to practice mode, expecting this old internet wisdom to be total bunk. And it wasn't. I pressed Z over the F-160 and it worked! I unlocked the F-200 supercar! This fabled V14 of legend takes a long time to get up to speed, but once you're into 7th gear, it flies. Steering is extremely tight, almost too good. I kept crashing. Normally when you steer, your car goes into this drift. Supercar doesn't drift, firmly clutching the asphalt with its sharp-clawed tires. The default F1 car has a top speed of 203 miles per hour, and this sucker goes up to 254. Insane. I couldn't find any videos of this online or even posts talking about it. Procrastination Land and Chuck Tolman himself are the only two sources that brought it up. I'm not sure how many people unlocked this or even realized they unlocked it. Placing a perfect first in Grand Prix doesn't give you a message saying you've unlocked anything, only becoming available in practice mode by pressing the right button. So if you're watching and you've already beaten Grand Prix by placing first on every track, try going to practice mode and press Z over the F-160. Maybe you've unlocked it. Fun fact! Amazon Falls appears to have a cancelled shortcut. It's behind this barrier. If you drive into it correctly with the F1 car, you can take a tour of the shortcut yourself. Since it wasn't actually meant to be a playable part of the track, crashing makes the game camera totally freak out. Your car has to respawn somewhere on the real track, totally messing up your race. Don't take this shortcut if you want to win something. When I asked Tolman about this after the interview, he said it was meant to be some kind of shortcut, which was cut from the final build. If you go spelunking through Usenet posts of the mid-90s, you'll find Time Warner's Virtua Racing had troubling delays. Many games of this time period went through the same thing. The game was publicly announced in October of 1994. Later at E3, when the Saturn launched surprisingly, the Tronix E3 video shows this jabroni playing an early build with the racing wheel. They're playing it very poorly, barely able to stay on the track midway through Bay Bridge. It sounds like a bizarre placeholder song is playing, but that could also be coming from another game. You do hear the crash noise, confirming sound is coming from this Virtua Racing demo. The track model itself does not appear to have any major differences, but this camera angle did change slightly in the final build. It's also seen in Anthony P's E3 95 video. No new tracks are present and the loading screen is bland. Not the amazing bouncing letter party we get in the final release. Again, it uses the racing wheel, and again, the player isn't doing too well. Here's a discussion on Usenet at around the same time, where people who played the Saturn demo at E3 said it looked very nice, but the control didn't seem fixed up yet. So either the controls weren't refined yet, or everyone who touched this at E3 totally blows at Virtua Racing. Early builds do not appear in the bootleg sampler, a demo disc that came with Saturns. There is, however, a leaked prototype on Hidden Palace. It has a volume creation date for September 7th, 1995, about 2 months before it hit store shelves. I didn't notice any differences. My guess is this might be an early prototype given to reviewers. Virtua Racing on Saturn was widely scheduled for a September release, but it and many other Saturn games were reportedly getting delayed by a week every time it seemed like it was almost coming out. Getting discs pressed was a common issue. By the time November 6, 95 rolled around, Time Warner Interactive's VR Virtua Racing finally hit store shelves in North America. That's a hell of a mouthful.
Do you remember why VR was like part of the title? Like it was VR.
I remember Racing. Wondering that myself. It stands for Virtua Racing.
Okay, so it's Virtua Racing, like.
So
yes, it actually
is. It's not compatible with the with an HTC Vive or anything then?
No.
Gotcha.
When looking at reviews of the mid-90s, Virtua Racing already seemed to be a dead meme. Next Generation says this is, quote, less than the video gaming scoop of the year, especially with games like Sega Rally on the way. They call it a near-perfect arcade port, praising its additional content. Scary Larry of GamePro went nuts over this, friggin' loved it. He also adores the extra content, saying it controls just like in the arcade. The only thing he criticized was sound design. EGM called it a lot of fun, saying if you liked the older ports, you will love this. It did mention there is still something missing, saying the graphics could have been better on Saturn. GameFan magazine seems to have the only American reviewers noticing how different this feels in the arcade, criticizing the game for not accurately portraying the handling. They do compliment the extra content and give it good scores. The UK's Sega Saturn magazine acknowledges it's not an arcade-perfect port, but loves the gargantuan amount of tracks, saying it's clear they put loads of effort into a home product rather than a simple arcade conversion. These critics seem to be more concerned about it being an older racer, competing with upcoming textured genre titles. They're not too worked up about its comparisons to the arcade. Makes sense, since at this point in the 5th gen, much of the gaming public is looking forward to creamy 3D graphics.
Creamy 3D graphics.
Posts online from non-critics were more aware of the differing controls. The old Dave Saturn page absolutely dumped on this port, calling it a poor translation with graphics worse than that of the 32X. Just a few days after the game came out, this guy put up his copy for sale. Conversely, this man wrote up a long review praising the port and its extra content, only criticizing the sound. Then he got into an internet argument with Marty Chin, who disagreed with the glowing assessment. Similarly, retrospective reviews of the modern age clash over Saturn's Virtua Racing. Some critics, like Mark of CGR, love it. He even called it the king of home console conversions. Many others hate the different handling. Some trash its graphics and say they like the 32X port better. Forums and Saturn social media feeds also have mixed opinions. Like when I tweeted out that I interviewed Chuck Tolman, someone asked why did they ruin the game. Others say it's their favorite racing game on the entire console.
Do you think you guys would have been better off if you had the source?
Well, probably, because you'd then have a jump start on getting it up and running. The downside to porting somebody else's code is that you don't start out with a deep understanding of what's there, so you have to spend a lot of time learning what they did.
You have to give credit where it's due. As I said before, this is still the port with the most content, and many critics agree the extra content is the polish that makes this shine. Even though they were given some exceptionally lame work conditions, they made a very competent racing game that stands up on its own. I had a great time working through Grand Prix, tearing it up with those new vehicles.
There have been a few more ports of Virtua Racing since then, and still the Saturn version has the most content. How does it feel kind of knowing that that project from way back then kind of withstood the test of time, at least in terms of like track variety and the amount of vehicles and such?
It's very gratifying. I think it's one of the projects that we were the proudest of anything that I worked on there. I think the only other project I worked on there that I was similarly proud of was probably the Wayne Gretzky game. And so this one's kind of unique in the way in which we were able to add all that new content. So we had fun with that, and that was really cool.
Tolman says one of his favorite parts about development was seeing it all come together at the end.
Felt like you were playing Virtua Racing and had all this stuff that wasn't in the original. That was just really very satisfying.
Any least favorite part about developing this port?
Yeah, the hardware debugger.
I was gonna say that was my guess.
I cursed at that machine quite a lot.
I can smell that roast cooking in the comment section already. Yeah, I liked it. The generous quantity of tracks and cars make this stand out among Saturn's racing games, but if it had a more accurate portrayal of the original arcade handling, and better collision detection, this would have ranked all the way into the legendary section. At least we can safely say the negatives are not totally Time Warner's fault. Don't get me wrong, I understand why some people despise it. It's largely untrue to the original, has graphical flaws, and nasty collision detection at times. It's not wrong to prefer the 32X port above all. I mean, it's fantastic, and the two new tracks are an absolute smash. In order to truly appreciate Time Warner Interactive's VR Virtua Racing, you need to separate yourself from the arcade original. I know, that's pretty hard when it's using the same tracks, vehicles, and name, but by itself, as a standalone experience not compared to its forebears, it's a fun game. As Yu Suzuki said, the main thing is to have fun. It's not 100% accurate and it's not as polished, but it's still fun. I'd recommend this to any retro racing fan, not to anyone looking for a pristine port of Virtua Racing. The inconsistent frame rate and the lack of 3D pad support can both be solved with emulation. Mednafen plays Saturn's Virtua Racing better than the actual hardware. You can easily map the racing wheel controls to an analog USB controller. In my opinion, this is the ultimate way to experience this port. You get the all-new content and little fuss from the hardware. Plus, the frame rate stays consistent. Since 1995, no port surpassed this in quantity. Virtua Racing Flat Out on PS2 takes some inspiration from Time Warner for its extra tracks. An uncommon mobile phone port was made. This is pre-smartphone. It's very difficult to find any way to play this nowadays. Even a GBA port was in development before getting cancelled. In recent years, the Nintendo Switch got the very first dose of pure arcade perfection. The incredible M2 brought this insanely accurate conversion to those drifty Joy-Cons, upgrading the draw distance to modern-day standards and boosting the frame rate from 30 to a crisp 60. It even uses the original source code. Finding it was apparently tough. Many thought it was lost forever. But Sega Age's lead producer, Rieko Kodama, managed to track it down. Turns out the original devs kept it privately. Other than wrestling with MAME, this Switch port is by far the most accessible way to play the original arcade game. I'd say all ports are a terrific way to celebrate this groundbreak in Yu Suzuki's career. He continued his quest to make immersion games with Virtua Fighter, a gyroscope thing, and Shenmue. His head seemed to always be several decades into the future at all times. And that's super clear in this Next Generation interview, published the same month as Saturn's Virtua Racing. He really starts smelling the colors here. When asked, what is the next technological step? He says, in the future, if it becomes possible to link the user's brainwave responses to the game character's movements, the character would become the ultimate second self. 26 years later, and we're getting there, but not quite into this Sword Art Online cyber future quite yet. Hopefully he stays alive long enough to see it. After Virtua Racing, Chuck Tolman continued on with a pretty fantastic career in the video game industry. He later got a high-up role with Treyarch and Activision, working on the outstanding Dreamcast ports of Spider-Man and Tony Hawk. He also got to help make the open-world Spider-Man movie games. Now he's a chief technology advisor for Skydance Interactive, and most recently worked on the critically acclaimed VR game, Walking Dead: Saints and Sinners. I recently gave it a buy on my Oculus Quest, and holy hell, Chuck, you guys did a killer job on this one. Perhaps this is the next step into Suzuki's crazy brainwave games.
Past 25 years, you've been doing games, and you told me when you were in college, you weren't necessarily going to get into games. And here you are, 2.5 decades of doing games. Did you see yourself in this position all those years ago?
No, I didn't predict any of it. It's been a pretty wild ride, I have to say. I've been really fortunate getting to work on all these things. Something that I might have otherwise tried to do as a hobby, maybe, and getting to do that in order to make a living is I'm so blessed. It's been amazing. Obviously, it's work is work. Obviously, it isn't fun in games the whole time or anything, but
Exactly.
It's very satisfying to get to do something that you personally love. Like it's a subject matter, that is close to your heart or that you just have a lot of passion for. It's hard to find something better than that.
To the one, to the three. I'm like, great job, and a good birdie. I don't play conservatively, just a little game pressure and consistency. 3 to the 4 to the 5 to the putt. Today is make or break. Can you make the cut? I've got a great eagle on hole number 9. Think you can get it inside mine? Try your best in that. And study my shot. I've got to catch my rivals a lot quicker than I thought. Great, I can get my second shot on the green from here. The real battle starts now at Pebble Beach. Nice par. Let's hope you win next time.